Karen Snyder was born on July 29, 1948, in the small American town of Cedar Lake, Indiana. She grew up in a very large family with 2 brothers and 3 sisters. In high school, Karen met a boy named Paul, and they decided to get married when she was just 17. Shortly after, Karen became pregnant, and in 1966, their daughter Paula was born. Even though Karen was only 18 at the time, she and her husband were ready and happy to start their own family. They moved to a town called Calumet, Illinois, where Paul's parents lived. The family settled on the same street as his parents, just a few houses away, allowing them to see Paul every day and spend a lot of time with their granddaughter. Calumet, with a population of about 25,000 residents, was located not far from Chicago and considered a very safe place to live. Karen spent most of her time taking care of their child, while Paul got a job at the local railroad. On November 12, 1966, Paul went to his night shift around 2 p.m. A few hours later, he tried to call Karen, but she didn't answer. This was unusual because she was supposed to be at home and couldn't have left their 2-month-old daughter alone. Concerned, he called his parents, who lived just a few houses away, and asked them to check on Karen. They walked down the street and knocked on the door, but there was no response. His parents didn't have a spare key, so they continued knocking for a few minutes and then went back home to call their son. Paul became even more worried and decided to leave work early to check if everything was all right. As he approached the house, his concern grew even more. The porch light was off and the blinds were tightly closed. This was unusual because Karen always left the porch light on for him when he worked the night shift. Paul tried to open the door with his key and realized it was unlocked. He entered the living room and was relieved to find his 2-month-old daughter sleeping in a playpen near the working TV. However, Karen was nowhere to be seen, so he began calling out her name while checking each room. As Paul decided to go upstairs, he tried to turn on the staircase light, but the switch didn't work. He made his way to the bedroom and turned on a lamp, revealing a horrifying scene. The room was in disarray, and there was blood everywhere. On the floor lay Karen, showing no signs of life, and Paul immediately realized she was dead. Recovering from the shock, Paul went downstairs, called the police, and took his daughter outside. While he was waiting for the police and ambulance, his parents came out to the street and saw him crying and pleading for help. Paul's mother grabbed a flashlight and rushed into the house, hoping to help Karen. But as soon as she saw Karen's blood-covered body, she knew it was too late to save her. Soon after, the medics and police arrived. The doctors could only confirm Karen's death, and the investigators began examining the crime scene. On the back door lock, they found shallow scratches, indicating an attempted break-in. However, the door was still locked, suggesting the intruder initially tried to enter this way, but failed. Next, they discovered a broken basement window with a trail of blood leading from it to the front door. Investigators speculated that after failing to open the back door, the intruder tried to enter through the basement and cut themselves on the glass, evidenced by the blood on it. The fact that the intruder didn't enter through the basement but went to the front door suggests it was either unlocked or Karen opened it herself. In the living room, they found more blood, indicating that the attack likely started there, catching Karen near her daughter's crib. The blood trail continued from the living room, up the stairs, down the hallway, and into the couple's bedroom, where Karen's body was found. The bedroom was a chaotic scene, blood everywhere, and many items scattered and broken, indicating Karen fought back fiercely. There was a phone in the bedroom, but it had been ripped from the wall. Police believe Karen might have run there ahead of the intruder to call for help, but she couldn't. In those days, there wasn't a single emergency number like 911. Local police had their own number, so detectives thought she might have dialed incorrectly in her haste. Investigators also found a blood-covered light bulb on the floor, which had been unscrewed from the socket above the stairs. It seemed the intruder did this, though the reason was unclear. Perhaps he unscrewed it while following Karen upstairs, giving her a brief moment to try calling the police. In the downstairs bathroom, police discovered a pile of bloodied clothes and various items. Among them were a pair of pants, a bedsheet, and a washcloth. Detectives speculated that the killer used these items to wipe the blood off his hands and clothes. It appeared he also attempted to clean himself with the washcloth, or possibly tried to use it to wipe blood off the floor to cover his tracks. However, given the amount of blood throughout the house, these efforts were clearly futile. After using these items, the killer threw them into the bathtub and fled the scene. This indicated to investigators that he remained in the house for some time after the murder, although they couldn't determine the exact period of time. Detectives began their investigation and quickly ruled out the possibility of a botched robbery. The only missing items were Karen's blue wallet, containing about $50, and one of the bedside lamps, which had no significant value. Medical examiners found 124 stab wounds on Karen's body, most concentrated in the chest area. Such brutality suggested the attacker had personal motives. Experts identified the likely weapon as a knife with a narrow blade, similar to a stiletto, but police couldn't find it inside the house or anywhere nearby. Karen was fully clothed and no signs of sexual assault were found, but investigators didn't rule out that the attacker might have had such a motive, but for some reason was unable to carry it out. The time of death was estimated between 4 and 6 p.m. Since Paul discovered her body around 11 p.m., the killer must have left the house several hours earlier. Detectives began their investigation by speaking with the victim's relatives and friends. According to Paul's mother, Karen had mentioned being afraid to live in that house and said she wanted to move to Indiana where her parents lived. However, she didn't specify the reasons for her fear, and investigators couldn't find any more information. Karen's neighbors also provided an interesting observation. Their dog, which usually barked at the slightest noise, remained quiet that evening. With no other leads, the police turned their focus to Karen's husband, Paul. In such crimes, the spouse is often the primary suspect, so they began investigating him. After analyzing the evidence from the house, detectives concluded that the attempted break-in at the back door and the broken basement window might have been staged. The killer was likely someone familiar with Karen, but tried to make it appear as if a random intruder had committed the crime. This suggested that either Karen willingly opened the door to the killer or they had a key. Investigators began interrogating Paul while also trying to establish whether he had the opportunity to commit the crime. They considered the possibility that he might have killed Karen before leaving for his evening shift, as he had left home after lunch that day. They also checked whether he remained at work for the entire shift or if he had left at any point. Paul denied any involvement in the murder, but the police continued to view him as the prime suspect. With almost no evidence, they attempted to obtain a confession from him, repeatedly calling him in for questioning. But despite this pressure, Paul consistently maintained his innocence. Karen's funeral took place 6 days after the murder. Besides family and friends, detectives also attended the ceremony and soon noticed something weird. One of the pallbearers had a deep wound on his forehead and a bandaged hand. The police identified this man as James Barbier, a friend of both Paul and Karen. He worked with Paul at the railroad and had done some repairs in the house shortly before the murder. Karen knew James pretty well and might have opened the door for him. Investigators began looking into James and discovered that on the evening of the murder, he had gone to a local hospital with serious injuries to his hand and face, requiring stitches. This aligned with the evidence suggesting the killer injured himself on the broken basement window glass. James became the second suspect, and detectives brought him in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the murder, explaining his injuries by saying that he had been returning home drunk from a bar that evening, tripped over a stump in the dark, and hurt himself on some splinters. James's wife confirmed that he came home that night drunk, with a bandaged hand and a cut on his forehead. She mentioned that he was acting weird and was visibly shaken. but she added that James was an alcoholic and frequently got heavily drunk, so this behavior wasn't unusual. When police interviewed individuals who frequented bars in Karen's neighborhood, they found witnesses who had seen James there that day. However, they couldn't pinpoint the exact times he was present. When experts finished analyzing the evidence from Karen's house, they found something intriguing. As suspected, there were two different types of blood. One matched Karen's blood type, while the other belonged to a different blood type, the same as James's. Although this blood type match was not proof of James' guilt, detectives decided to arrest him, hoping he would confess. They also cleared Karen's husband of suspicion, as none of the blood samples matched his type. James continued to deny his involvement, insisting that his injuries were from his fall. The police hoped forensic experts might find some additional evidence, but they faced disappointment. The fingerprints collected from the crime scene were smudged, and without DNA analysis, they couldn't make any progress with the blood evidence. Eventually, they had to release James and continued searching for new leads. Since then, investigators have looked into several other suspects and interviewed dozens of people, but the case remained unsolved for many years. Karen's murder forever changed their small town, once considered safe. Residents remembered the brutal crime for a long time and wondered who could have committed it. At the time, police did not reveal the identities of the suspects, including James, so only Karen's relatives and close friends knew of his potential involvement. In later interviews with reporters, they said they truly believed James was guilty, but without solid evidence, proving his involvement was simply impossible. Karen's father passed away in 1973, 7 years after the tragedy, and her mother died in 1977. Neither of them ever found out who killed their daughter. Paul eventually remarried, and his second wife helped raise Paula, essentially becoming the mother the girl never had the chance to remember. Her relatives decided not to tell her how her biological mother died, trying to shield the girl from the horrific details. Paula later recalled that when she started school, other kids teased her simply because her mother was dead. A few years later, understanding that she might hear the truth from others or come across news reports, her relatives finally told her what had happened to Karen. In 1989, at the age of 45, Paul passed away from health problems, never learning the truth either. For decades, there was no progress on the case. Paula occasionally gave interviews to journalists, expressing her hope to bring the culprit to justice and mentioning that she regularly contacted the local police department to ask about any new developments. But they always replied that there were no new leads, and the case remained unsolved for many years. This continued until the end of 2022, when one day the police received a call. A 29-year-old man contacted the police department responsible for Karen's case, inquiring about any new developments. The man explained that he had known about this crime his whole life, as his grandmother talked about it since he was a kid. It turned out they were distant relatives of Karen's family, and the man was curious whether the police had made any progress in solving the mystery. He said that he had been reading newspaper clippings about the case at work and wondered if there were any modern technologies that could help solve it. And this prompted him to reach out to the police. To his surprise, the police department decided to reopen the investigation following his call. Naturally, none of the original detectives were still around, so a new team began reviewing all the available materials from scratch. They discovered that almost all the evidence, except the blood samples collected from the floor, had not only been preserved, but was also well maintained over the past 56 years. This included Karen's clothing and various items from her home. The detectives sent all the remaining evidence to the lab, where experts began examining each item with modern tools. Meanwhile, the police re-interviewed everyone connected to the case who was still alive. 16 months after the investigation was reopened, detectives received a long-awaited call from the lab. Experts had found several drops of blood on Karen's dress and extracted a DNA profile of an unknown male. The police immediately obtained a warrant from a judge to collect a genetic sample from the main suspect, James, who was still alive. They quickly got his sample, sent it to the lab, and soon received confirmation. James's DNA matched the blood found on Karen's dress. This confirmed that James, who was just 21 years old at the time of Karen's death, had been in her home the day she was murdered and had initially lied about how he got his injuries. On April 29, 2024, the police returned to James's home, and the 79-year-old man was finally arrested for murder. Upon being informed of the DNA match, James did not deny anything and confessed to the crime. While the police have not yet disclosed all details of his interrogation due to the ongoing legal proceedings, James admitted that he had known his entire life that he would eventually be caught. James has been charged with first-degree murder and was released on bail due to his age and severe health conditions. Given James's state, the risk of him fleeing was considered nearly non-existent. However, Karen's relatives were upset because they had already suffered enough seeing the killer live freely for over 50 years. As for the motive, it remains unknown. The first hearing took place at the end of May, and more details are expected to be revealed only after the trial. According to the main theory reported by journalists, James had feelings for Karen and was jealous of her husband since she married him. Additionally, James was indeed heavily intoxicated that evening, which may have driven him to commit the crime. Karen's relatives expressed their gratitude to the detectives for finally bringing James to justice. However, given his health issues, even if James lives to see prison, he is unlikely to spend much time there. Karen's daughter, who was 57 at the time of James's arrest, said she received the best call of her life when she learned that her mother's killer had finally been caught. She admitted she had lost hope and was surprised that the evidence had been so well preserved. She also revealed that she blames James for her father's early death. Beyond dealing with the brutal murder of his wife, her father had spent the rest of his life almost certain that his close friend was responsible, and it was very hard for him to see James continue to live freely. Debbie Lynn Randall was born on August 21, 1962, in Marietta, Georgia. She grew up in a loving family with two older brothers. Sometime after Debbie's birth, her parents divorced, but her dad remained involved in their lives. A few years later, their mom married a man named Roy, and he became Debbie's stepfather. They all lived in a small apartment building in a quiet neighborhood near a military base. Debbie was a typical, cheerful kid who loved hanging out with friends and playing basketball. She also loved dolls. Debbie had a large collection and spent a lot of time playing with them. On January 13, 1972, when Debbie was 9 years old, she had dinner with her family. After that, her mom decided to send her to the laundromat, as she had done many times before. Debbie was supposed to keep an eye on the laundry while it washed, while someone else from the family would help her carry the clothes to the laundromat and back home. The laundromat was just a few hundred yards away from their home, right across the street, so her mom wasn't too worried about anything happening to her. Back then, it was quite common for parents to have their kids help with chores like laundry, and Debbie even made some friends with the other girls at the laundromat. On that day, her mom wanted to send Debbie's older brother along, but he wasn't feeling well and wanted to watch his favorite TV show. So, the mother asked her husband to take the laundry instead, and Debbie went along with him, grabbing a box of detergent on the way. Her stepdad dropped off the laundry, loaded it into 2 washing machines, and left, while Debbie stayed to wait for the wash to finish. After that, she was supposed to walk home and ask someone to pick up the clean clothes as she couldn't carry them all by herself. Sometime later, Debbie's mom noticed that she still hadn't returned, even though the laundry should have been done by then. It was getting dark outside, so she and her husband decided to walk to the laundromat, but Debbie wasn't there. The employee told them that she had left a while ago and hadn't come back since. Her mom became worried and started to walk around the nearby streets with Roy, searching for Debbie. Soon, they noticed something strange. A few dozen yards from the laundromat, in the parking lot next to one of the cars, there was spilled detergent. Since Debbie was carrying the box of detergent, her mom immediately thought it might have belonged to her. They continued to search the parking lot and the surrounding area, but there were no other signs of Debbie. Some neighbors who knew the family well also joined in to help with the search, but all their efforts yielded no results, and Debbie's mom decided to contact the police. The officers examined the area of the parking lot where the detergent was spilled and noticed their first potential lead. The detergent was scattered just inches away from a parked car, and on its door, they spotted several clear fingerprints. Those prints appeared fresh and were located significantly lower than the handle, which already seemed odd. The officers thought that at this exact spot, an unknown perpetrator might have grabbed the girl and touched the car in the process. They collected these prints and handed them over to forensic experts, while also beginning to search for the owner of the vehicle to confirm if the prints didn't belong to them. With no other leads, the police started combing the streets, trying to find new clues or witnesses. The laundromat employee mentioned that she hadn't noticed anything suspicious. Debbie had been sitting and waiting for the laundry to finish, then took her box of detergent and left the building. Most likely, she headed home to ask someone to pick up the clothes. The police soon found the first witness whose account immediately changed the course of the investigation. 12-year-old Sandra, along with her friend, was walking to the same laundromat, helping her carry dirty clothes. Suddenly, they saw a man grabbing a girl in the middle of the street and pulling her into his car, parked nearby the laundromat. The girl was screaming and trying to break free, but he slammed the door shut, got behind the wheel, and drove off. The man nearly hit Sandra and her friend. One of the girls started shouting after him, but he sped away. At the time, Sandra didn't realize she had witnessed an abduction. She thought the man was the girl's father or some other relative picking her up, while she wanted to stay out longer. Because of this, Sandra didn't tell any adults about what happened or report it to the police. Now, when she learned about Debbie's abduction, she provided investigators with crucial information. Based on her description, the perpetrator drove a dark pickup truck, likely a 1957 model according to her description. She described the man as young, white, with thick, dark hair. He wore a white t-shirt, jeans, and black work boots. Another girl who lived in the same building as Debbie also shared her observations. That evening, she was standing outside her apartment when a dark pickup truck drove past the building. At first, she thought it was her uncle behind the wheel. But when the driver stopped right in front of her and looked at the girl, she realized it wasn't him. According to her description, it was a white man with medium-length dark hair. She also provided investigators with a few more details about his appearance that she could remember. The girl mentioned that this man parked near their building, next to the same car where the spilled detergent would later be found. The police soon found another witness. A man who lived near Debbie's house was driving to the hospital to visit his wife. At one point, a dark pickup truck, likely a Dodge, nearly crashed into him before driving off recklessly. The driver appeared to be around 30 years old with dark hair. However, the most crucial detail was that the witness also saw a girl in his car, seemingly attempting to escape while the driver held her with one hand. After listening to all these accounts, the police had no doubt that Debbie had been abducted. They distributed information about the suspect's vehicle to all patrol units, and police artists created a sketch based on the testimonies of the three witnesses. While some officers were searching for similar vehicles and checking their owners, others organized extensive searches for Debbie. With each day, more volunteers and police officers from other towns joined in. In total, around 4,000 people were involved in the search, setting a record not only for the city, but for the entire state. Detectives also investigated various people who knew Debbie, including all male neighbors, her stepfather, and her biological father, but all of them were ruled out as suspects. Her father, who lived in the same city, learned about his daughter's disappearance at work and immediately joined the search efforts. Detectives checked previously convicted criminals living within a few mile radius of Debbie's home, but they didn't find any suitable suspects among them. The extensive search efforts continued for over 2 weeks without yielding any results. This went on until January 29th, when several students joined the search teams and were sent to explore the wooded area several miles from Debbie's house. After spending nearly 5 hours there, one of them suddenly noticed tracks on the ground leading from the trail into the depths of the forest, as if something had been dragged there. Following the tracks deeper into the woods for about 150 feet, they stumbled upon a human body and immediately called the officers. They quickly realized that they had found Debbie Randall. She was wearing the same clothes described by her mother on the day of her abduction, a lavender dress and a dark blue zip-up jacket with a hood. However, her shoes were missing. She had socks on, but her lavender shoes were nowhere to be found. She had received these shoes as a Christmas gift just a few weeks before her disappearance, and she loved them very much. Her body was handed over to medical experts, who determined that she had died from strangulation. The victim had also been sexually assaulted. Experts found a single dark hair on her body, most likely belonging to the killer. Since DNA analysis was not used at that time, experts couldn't do much with this evidence. They examined it under a microscope and, based on their knowledge at the time, concluded that it belonged to a man aged between 18 and 30 years old. Debbie's clothing was also covered in dirt, and lacking other leads, detectives decided to examine it more thoroughly. They contacted a geologist and asked him to work with their forensic team. Together, they determined that some of the dirt consisted of a particular type of clay mined less than 10 miles from their city. The geologist confirmed that it was indeed the unique northern Georgia clay that couldn't be found anywhere else nearby. There were also other dirt stains, different from the first. They were traced back to another type of clay mined by a local company just 2 miles from where the body was discovered. Based on this information, detectives theorized that the perpetrator didn't kill the victim immediately. Instead, he drove her to remote areas where those types of clay were located. Most likely, he initially took her out of town, where he sexually assaulted her. Then, he drove to the location where the second type of clay was mined, killed her, and took her to the forest, dragging her body behind the trees and leaving it there. Supporting this theory were not only the clay traces, but also the forensic analysis indicating that Debbie was already dead when brought to the forest. If the perpetrator had killed her there would have been signs of a struggle around that area. The traces on the ground from the trail into the trees also suggested that the victim was already dead. The clay mining sites were quite remote and difficult to access, leading detectives to speculate that the killer might have worked there. They reached out to the mining companies, and a supervisor for one of them confirmed this theory. It was hard to believe that someone unfamiliar with that area could have taken the abducted girl there. Even the workers themselves sometimes struggled to navigate through these vast areas. Police checked employees from both companies, trying to find a man matching the description or the similar vehicle, but it didn't lead to anything. They also had fingerprints left on the car just inches away from the abduction site and compared them with all suspects, but this yielded no results either. The news of Debbie's brutal murder shook the entire city, and thousands of people came to bid farewell at her funeral. The local police department continued their efforts to find the killer and bring them to justice, but they couldn't find any new leads, hitting dead ends over and over again. Eventually, the case remained unsolved for many years. Detectives continued to work on it, checking dozens of suspects, but they couldn't establish their involvement. For the lead detective on the case, Morris Nix, Debbie's murder remained a priority throughout his entire career. The crime happened when he was just 19, and he had been involved in the search and investigation from day one. For many years, Nix pursued various leads, scrutinized different suspects, and eventually compiled a list of 4 men whom he considered the most likely suspects. When the FBI established a DNA database, experts were able to extract the genetic profile of the perpetrator from the hair found on Debbie's body. It was entered into the database, but no matches were found. This indicated that the killer either had never been convicted of other serious crimes, or it occurred before the time when DNA samples started being collected from such individuals. In 2015, 43 years after the murder, the case was reopened, and detectives decided to re-examine the victim's clothing using modern technology. It had been stored in the evidence warehouse all this time, and experts found biological material from an unknown man on it. However, over the years, it had degraded significantly, resulting in a partial profile. In 2018, Debbie's mother, who had hoped for decades to see the police arrest her daughter's killer and hold him accountable, gave an interview. She said that after Debbie's murder, she couldn't bear to live in the apartment where everything reminded her of her loss. She moved to another city, and year after year, the lack of progress in the investigation slowly destroyed her. She also said her only desire now is to see the closure of this case before her time comes. Unfortunately, that was not meant to happen. Just a few weeks after the interview, she passed away to cancer at the age of 78, and she was laid to rest next to her daughter. Sandra, who witnessed the abduction at the age of 12, also spoke out in an interview. She said that she had never stopped blaming herself over the years. According to Sandra, she believed she could have stopped the perpetrator and prevented the abduction, even if it meant taking Debbie's place and dying instead of her. In 2019, the local police department received additional funding, enabling them to request a more detailed analysis of Debbie's clothing. This time, experts were able to extract a full DNA sample from it, but the perpetrator's DNA still wasn't in the FBI database. Debbie's father was also interviewed, and he shared that not a day had gone by over the decades when he didn't think about Debbie. He still kept a box of her old photos, hoping for only one thing: to reunite with his daughter in heaven. In 2022, shortly after the interview, he passed away. In the same year, detectives focused all their efforts on the one lead they had: DNA. They reached out to a company in Florida specializing on an innovative DNA analysis method called genetic genealogy. The police handed over all the biological samples they had collected over the years and waited. Experts created a profile of the unknown man and began searching for his relatives in public genetic databases. They needed to find people who had uploaded their DNA because family members' genetic material has similarities. Modern tools can detect even distant relatives. After examining thousands of potential relatives of the killer, investigators narrowed down their search to a family living in Marietta in 2023. They asked them to provide DNA samples, and they agreed. The analysis showed that the killer was indeed their close relative, so experts looked into their family more carefully. They soon identified the most likely owner of the killer's DNA sample: a man named William Rose. However, there was a problem. Rose had taken his own life in 1974, just 2 years after Debbie's murder. But detectives were determined to finally close this case, no matter what. They obtained a warrant to exhume his grave, and experts took a direct DNA sample from his remains. After 51 years since Debbie's murder, the police finally got a full match. William Rose was indeed the killer. At the time of the murder, he was only 24 years old and had never been a suspect. It turned out that his relatives lived in the same building as Debbie's family. Rose regularly visited them, so investigators believed that he might have seen the girl on multiple occasions. Perhaps that evening he was headed to visit his relatives, but saw Debbie coming out of the laundromat and heading towards her home. Based on the testimonies of her neighbors and other witnesses, Rose pulled into the parking lot between the victim's house and the laundromat, left the engine running, got out, grabbed Debbie, and then drove north. Perhaps he immediately headed to the clay quarry, which was located in that direction. It's worth mentioning that Rose didn't have any other criminal record. Either he didn't commit anything serious besides Debbie's murder, or he simply didn't get caught. At the time the case was solved, the only living close relative of the victim was her older brother, Melvin. He attended the press conference where they announced the discovery of the culprit and thanked everyone who had worked on his sister's case for over half a century. He also said he wished his mom could have lived to see this moment, but added that she was now in heaven with Debbie.